Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the fantasy of the almighty psychotherapist. So for this fantasy, I will explain what it is first and foremost, then I'll go into three contexts of this fantasy. The first being the patient, the second is being the teams in institutions or in collaborative work, and the third is when this fantasy applies to the therapist themselves. So before we begin, I want to make very clear that this fantasy of the almighty therapist applies regardless of profession, be it a social worker, a psychiatric nurse, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a psychotherapist. It applies for all of these, and psychoanalyst, should I add. It applies throughout all of these. So what do I mean by the fantasy of the almighty psychotherapist? Well, it is a fantasy in which basically the therapist holds all the cards, that basically the therapist is capable of understanding everything incredibly quickly, give a solution that satisfies everyone and every party, understand the psyche of the individual they have in front of them, have little to no doubt, in a way being able to represent the ideal as presented by, for example, TV shows in Hollywood, in which, for example, the clinician meets a patient and, like, bam, they know everything and they can explain every type of behavior. So in the context of patients, this fantasy is often triggered by a form of transference in which they feel that the therapist might be an ideal fit for them, that the therapist understands them, that they get everything, that in these types of fantasies, the therapist is seen as all knowledgeable, meaning that the therapist knows everything. Often patients will, if they learn something in psychology, will ask the therapist, "Oh, well, I've learned this. You must know all about it. Could you please tell me?" And often, if it's on another branch, you might not even know precisely what they're talking about, but they still feel that you know everything, that you are an all expert, which is untrue because the field is so vast that no one knows everything, right? But yet they have that fantasy. They also have the fantasy that, for example, if you were to give advice, then your advice would be perfect, precise, that you'd be able to basically solve the situation if only they were able to apply your advice. So this fantasy is often derived from an unconscious ideal picture of a parent, or an ideal imago of a parent that is all-knowing, can guess the needs of the infants, can completely satisfy them. In a way, it's not so distant from the very moments, the very precise awakening of moments of love towards a partner, i.e. moments where one feels that all their needs are going to be fulfilled, and that the other one knows, and this is very important, the other one knows what we need. And this is a very potent fantasy. And in the fantasy of the almighty therapist, it's even more potent, because basically you have someone who has trained for years, if not decades. Therefore, they're all for you and they know everything, and therefore they're going to be able to fix you absolutely perfectly. Of course, this level of almighty fantasy is often very present with patients who have had little contact with psychologists or psychotherapists before coming into the session, or who themselves have a naive outlook on the therapy. When I mean naive, I don't mean that in any negative way. It's just that it's something that is more based in what people have seen in media rather than real clinical work, and that clinical work is much harder. Often during the first phases of that almighty therapist fantasy, what is important for the clinician is at the start to welcome it, not like bulldozer it completely from the get-go, because it is important for the patient to think and to feel that you do have some level of knowledge. Of course, the aim is not to cheat on the patient, of course not, but like going bulldozer, say, "No, I know nothing, you are the true expert of yourself," might feel for the patient too brutal, that this fantasy just comes down completely crashing, if it's not reinforced in a strange paradoxical way in which the patient will go, "Oh no, he's so humble that he doesn't want to show off his knowledge," and I can understand that. So it all might crash and the patient might distrust the therapist, or on the contrary, they might idealize them even more because thinking, oh, how modest of them to really not show off like that. I appreciate that trait, and so on and so forth. So the idea is to welcome it at the beginning, not confuse yourself for it, right? You're not the almighty therapist. No one is the almighty therapist. And this includes even the top people like Kernberg, like Ogden. No one is almighty, absolutely no one, but the patient might feel that. So at the very beginning, and I think this is basically what Kohut talked about, even though he talked about narcissists, I do feel that that also sometimes applies to patients to have an incredible hope for therapy or for themselves, and a hope that's so intense, so massive that they idealize the therapist as I think they idealize the primal relationship with the caregivers, in which it's they know me, they understand me, and perhaps they understand me better than I understand myself. Therefore, they will be perfect. They will just make me perfect as they are perfect. And in this illusion, because we can talk about illusion, it's important not to shadow it directly. So, as I was saying earlier, it is to be welcomed, but slowly deconstructed, slowly pushed aside by remarks, by the therapist themselves saying, in this field it's hard to know, it's not an exact science. You unbuild it slowly but surely so that the patient can reinstigate a form of, let's say, normal transference in which there's appreciation but also a bit of ambivalence, right? Because if it's all idealized, if you're all the therapist almighty all the time, then what is not talked about often is that that creates a lot of anxiety. Because if you're almighty, then if the patient does not apply the advice or does not conform, then they are at risk of being punished for that. And they start blaming themselves for what is occurring, which is like the mirror opposite of what we want. We want the patient to be able to gain trust in themselves, to be able to come to their own conclusion and apply their own configuration of advice, not follow blindly the one of the therapist. So it's very important to be able to deconstruct it, to not let the almighty therapist fantasy run wild for forever. Just the time it needs to settle down, the patient can accept a more, let's say, normal version of the therapist, a more, let's say, flawed version of the therapist. And I think that it's incredibly important when patients have that, to be able to unbuild it. And often when patients have a form of ambivalence, like, oh yeah, I know you can't tell me, or I know you don't really know them, so you can't really give me good advice. That's when you know basically the fantasy has been at least partly deconstructed. I'm not saying you can deconstruct it unconsciously that easily. No, of course not. It takes a lot of years, but still, something of that has been lowered in terms of intensity. Because remember, the bigger the hope, the bigger it might fall, or the bigger it might become pathological. It doesn't necessarily start that way, but it can become. So the therapist must not merge with that illusion of the almightiness, quite the opposite. So this is for the patients, right? Next, we're going to go for pluridisciplinary teams, i.e. institutional roles, or when you're working in groups of other professions like nurses, like educators, like trainers, and so on and so forth. In these cases, sometimes when they refer a patient to you, they will basically say, "Oh, you absolutely have to see W because W has this and that and that." And they will have the feeling that only you, the almighty therapist, the all-knowledgeful therapist, will be able to solve the problem. That what the psychiatrist, what the psychologist of other institutions said, all of that is meaningless. Only you can do that. And it can be the reverse, right? No, that only the psychiatrist, only the psychologist of the other institution can do something. You can't. Anyway, it can go both ways, right? But the idea behind it is that basically the team invests the psychotherapist from an almighty mission of healing the individual. And what is very interesting with this fantasy is that regardless of how it goes with the patient, you've seen, it could go incredibly well, it could go incredibly badly, right? What is very interesting and what I've remarked is that just the fact of having a session with them alleviates so much of the anxiety of the team. The team is like, oh, someone is handling it. this is good. This is going to be completely perfect, and then basically the patient's going to go better. And which is very interesting because often it doesn't change much in how the patient behaves, but the team has the feeling that the patient has been transformed absolutely, that there's no more issues. There's a sort of level of like, a sort of relief of the anxiety and of the anguish, because they trust the therapist with a form of almightiness, an ability to transform the patient from A to Z. I must also say that sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes the teams are incredibly disappointed by the session and by the effects of the session, saying it changed nothing, it's useless, and so on and so forth. And here you go from almighty therapist to complete useless therapist, which is also very interesting because you're all powerful, you're completely powerless, right? And basically, in those moments, they can attack the therapist. And I think that those are strangely more healthy moments when they can attack, and because you can then say, yes, well, it's not a one-to-one, it's not like save or just let go and abandon, right? It's hard work. And this also helps the team understand that this process of psychotherapy is a long-term process, especially with, for example, patients that suffer from schizophrenia or let's say more severe forms of autism. It's not going to be like in an instant, it's going to be slowly but surely, right? And the same goes for personality disorders. So the team can have very high hopes and expectations, hopes that can that can have a very interesting impact because they can believe that it has worked brilliantly, even though the psychologist or the clinician might say it was not that good of a result, but they can still believe it. And that's important for them to be able to just have the support of the clinician, regardless of what happens. Because I have this feeling that for teams, what happens with the patient, really from clinician to patient in a singular setting, is its own space, but the space of the team and what the team thinks of it is completely separate. Like whatever happens in the first space does not necessarily impact the second space, and vice versa, in a very strange and interesting fashion. So basically they might have that fantasy, and if it goes for the fantasy of an external, let's say, psychologist, psychiatrist, that they know very well, let's say, schizophrenia, so they're going to be able to give the precise medication, the precise thing. There's often a lot of expectations, and when the patient comes back, let's say, with slight improvements, there can be likewise a massive disappointment of like, but they saw the expert, so why aren't they brilliantly better? And again, good thing, because it allows them to have a more realistic expectation of what all these processes are. So the third and final form, which I'll be talking about, and perhaps, according to me at least, the more pathological form of it, is when the therapists themselves believe to be almighty. So I have not encountered it too many times, but when it happens, it, at least for me, is incredibly pathological, because basically, in the best case scenarios, the patient is projecting something into the therapist, and the therapist is identifying with the projection. I.e., the patient is like, you're the best, and the therapist is, yes, I'm the best, and I'm going to be able to heal you. I'm going to, for example, since start to act out, the therapist starts to act out things we're not supposed to do. Like, for example, if you're in psychotherapy with, let's say, a married woman, and she tells the therapist, you need to see my husband because he's not what I expect him to be. The almighty therapist might think, yes, I will change him. I will be able to, through my psychological, psychiatric, counseling knowledge, apply something, and then they will change. They will be able to fundamentally transform because my transformative power is exceptional. And often what I have seen is that these moments lead to catastrophic acting out on the behalf of the therapist, in which the therapist will just basically try and solve the situation in reality, whereas our whole job is to try and help people get the tools for themselves to be able to live their lives. In a way, these moments are terrible because the almighty psychotherapist is going to act out in the reality of the world in something which should not be done. And in a way, it might seem paradoxical, but they're going to deprive the patient of their own agency by acting out, i.e., I will do it because I'm more powerful. You don't need to act. You don't need to live your life. I will live your life for you. I will choose for you, which is inherently bad and wrong because we're depriving the patient of what psychotherapy is supposed to be, i.e., a moment in which the patient can live their lives for themselves to the fullest. Another massive problem is that sometimes psychotherapists will think that they are the best and therefore that the patient or the environment of the patient needs the best, which will lead to complete breakdowns of ethics and deontology. In those breakdowns, it can be things like testing, like IQ testing, projective tests, and so on and so forth. For example, their own family members, of the therapist, or friends. And I must say that this is incredibly pathological, as basically you're not allowed to. This is an ultimate line that you're not supposed to cross. But because they merge themselves with this idea of being almighty, they feel that they're above restrictions of our ethical code, that basically they can just be who they are who they are because the code is just a restriction for lesser therapists, people that don't understand that sometimes you need to bend the rules. And this is incredibly pathological because at that point the therapist no longer is on any playing field. They extend themselves into a position in which they do everything that they feel is good, that their unconscious basically is running wild. If we were to be a Kleinian, or give a Kleinian interpretation, we would say that they have a paranoid schizoid position in which basically they don't feel any limit to their power as therapists. And when they're confronted to a limit, they often have immense moments of rage and they don't want to hear it. They might even insult other therapists that are pushing back against that, because often those therapists that merge with the almighty fantasy want to convince others to do the same. They want to extend their thoughts and feelings and deontological breakdowns to other therapists in order to justify of what they're doing, which is wrong. And when you push back, then there starts to be a lot of interpersonal attacks of and they will start thinking that the therapists that push back are basically weaker and cowards to not even challenge the code, or that basically they're just there to maintain the dogma, and basically there will be a lot of despising. But that despising is because themselves, and that's what I think, at least that's always been my observation of it, my hypothesis, right, that these therapists basically know that they are doing wrong and they're harming both their patients and themselves, but they're unable to be conscious about it. That unconscious part that is fighting for, no, we need limitations, we need basically to reacquire the depressive position, i.e. that moment of renunciation, and be able to calm down and not be in this sort of manic or powerful phase, is there, but it gets repressed. And often what I've seen is when a limit comes through professional organizations, or even sometimes and rarely court cases, then it comes crashing down. The fantasy of the almighty therapist just collapses on itself, because then they realize what has happened and that they've gone too far. And this is often something that when the therapist is completely engulfed in it, is very hard to get away from it. But I will say that this fantasy can also have a more, let's say, nuanced and transitory phase. For example, a therapist might fantasize that, oh, if I could do this with my patient, then they would feel much better. If only, I don't know, let's say they have a fear of public spaces, right? Oh, if we went to go and see a concert, then they would be healed. Those transitory moments are not necessarily pathological, because the therapist might be able to withdraw from them and say, oh, what am I doing? What am I counter-transferentially experiencing? What does it send back within myself? So I'm not saying that all variants. I think that some variants which remain in fantasy are okay, and they might be worked on both for the needs of the patient, but also so that the therapists themselves can understand why they are so keen to go into that fantasy of almighty therapist. And also I should add that this fantasy, in the terms of everyone, but the therapist more so, is a protection against the anxiety of being powerless, the anxiety of our treatments failing, the anxiety that can be held through for numerous therapists that in the end we don't know. We never know if it's going to work out. And not knowing is incredibly frustrating and anxiety filling, because basically there's a risk, and we are always taking that risk when we're practicing. And to curtail that risk, when, for example, therapists feel fragile, they will just engage into this fantasy of the almighty therapist, because someone that's almighty does not commit mistakes, does not, at least subjectively, does not doubt, does not need to doubt, because they know, because they're all powerful, because they're going to do everything that needs to be done. And this is where it becomes pathological. But if it's a transient fantasy, the therapist can then start to doubt it, and then start to understand why, and they can use it to benefit the therapy that they're giving to the patient, and even sometimes benefit their own understanding of themselves. So that's basically what I think and what I feel about this fantasy. Of course, I am by no means saying that I am right or that I've been exhaustive. There might be other situations and other moments where it applies, but this was a conversation I wanted to have for a very long time, because I do think that it's unfortunately one of the risks for every context I've said, for the therapist, for the institution or the team, and for the patient, that all of them together might be at risk of this fantasy. And in this fantasy is not necessarily pathological, but it needs to be worked on, it needs to be thought about. It cannot be left unaddressed, and that's what I wanted to end on. So basically, I hope that you like this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.